r/AskReddit. People who have survived a murder attempt by dumb luck. What's your story? When I was about 10, my grandfather was dying from complications of his heart issues and mental deterioration. I didn't know him very well, as the last time we had been in contact him was when I was a baby. My father never liked him and didn't bother coming with me and my mother to visit him in the hospital. When we got there, he was resting peacefully and my mother went forward and whispered some words to him, I imagine, about his current state of health. I hang back a little bit because the creepy old guy whom I didn't recall seeing in my whole life really freaked me out. Regardless of my anxiety, my mom said I should approach grandpa and share some nice words with him. I understood by how sad my mother was that I shouldn't argue too much, so I approached his hospital bed to speak to him. He didn't seem conscious at all, so I just did what my mother did, leaning forward and just whisper some nice things to him. Things took turn when mid-sentence his eyes flare open and he stares at me, making me stop what I'm saying. My heart dropped into my ass when he looked at me because it was pure hatred in his eyes. As soon as we made eye contact, he bolted upright from his bed and wrapped his hands around my neck and started throttling me as hard as he could. I barely even remember what happened, but my mom was screaming for a nurse and grandpa kept yelling at me while shaking my neck violently, FCKING betrayal, you betray me. And then he died almost as fast as it began. It was over. His grip loosened and he flatlined. My mother was inconsolable and I was extremely confused and crying out of sheer trauma at the situation. Later, after we managed to calm down, a nurse explained to my mother that his severe dementia had left him barely coherent and it was likely he had thought I was someone else. I didn't learn this until several years later, but my mother suspected my grandfather saw my father in me. My father was an alcoholic, womanizer and fairly abusive in my earlier childhood, and my grandfather resented him for it. I guess I look a little too much like my dad. Was a bouncer at a club in LA for a minute in the 90s. Stopped some dudes clearly affiliated in a gang at the door after they refused security checks. After a few minutes of their threats and Manson lamps, they left spewing all sort of warnings. A little later it starts to wind down, and because it's a little slow and we are overstaffed, so I start to drink. I get a bit drunk, not wasted, but sleepy bust, so I tell my buddy I'm going to go lay down in the back of his car for a while. A few minutes after lying down, I realize I have to piss. I get out and stumble a few into a spot between a guard gate for a parking lot and a building for a little privacy. There's a few dozen people milling around in front of the club. I'm about 25 feet away from the club's entrance and just off an alleyway. While I'm relieving myself, a dude runs right past in front of me, around the guard booth to my rear, and unloads a 9mm recovered rounds from backseat/trunk/roof/bumper into the backseat of the car I just crawled out of. Bam 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 bam. Unloading into the car. He then turns, runs right back past me, and down the alley into the night. Don't think he saw me at all. Nothing really came of it, except my partner was convinced I was a marked man and refused to be near me for a year or so. Edit. Holy crap, I kind of expected this to get buried. This was Los Angeles. I was about 25, almost 50 now, so some specifics are long gone. But I remember this. My buddy was genuinely terrified by this. I don't think he knew anything about it. In fact, he seemed to interpret the event as a larger conspiracy to have me snuffed, not some random pissed off dude making a point/getting jumped in. And because he ditched the car/wouldn't take my calls, it got left at that. For those concerned with the car, it was like a 1980s rusted out sedan, maybe a $500 car. Details about the slugs/number of rounds fired were relayed to me later by third parties. My friend and I were known in the neighborhood. People were talking about it. Thank you for the well wishes. Honestly though, this wasn't even the first time I was shot at. It's been a long strange trip. Edit 2. Also, I tried to argue later that it's just as likely the guy was shooting at someone else across the street and that the car just got in the way. But there were holes all through that thing. Backseat had 4/5. Another 2/3 went into the back window and ended up in the backs of the front seats. Another 2/3 rounds went right into the trunk. I honestly don't know if he was a terrible shot or if he hit right what he was aiming for. Apologies if I'm doing this wrong. I suck at Reddit. Throwaway because it got some media. I'm a criminal defense attorney. I was representing this guy that had embezzled almost $500k from his business partner. He was looking down the barrel at several years in prison, a bunch of his assets had been seized by the government, was being sued by multiple creditors for north of $2 million, and was in the midst of an ugly divorce, and wasn't allowed to see his kids. I was one of 3 lawyers he had: criminal, civil and divorce. He was drinking a lot and using coke. I used to get this incoherent phone calls in the middle of the night that ranged from threats to crying. He came to my office one day and asked for me, but I was in court. My secretary said he was perfectly civil. He then went to his divorce lawyer's office and shot him to death. Got stopped by the police a short distance away and was wounded in a shootout. He would later tell the cops that he had come to my office to shoot me that day and also planned to shoot his civil attorney. Our neighbors when I was growing up had 3 kids the same ages as myself and my siblings. We were all friends and got along well for the most part. Their eldest child, I'll call him Peter, has Asperger's syndrome and was known to have outbursts that would sometimes be violent. One day, when I was 5 or 6, our mothers decided to take all 6 of us to a nearby wading pool because it was hot out. Well, due to that, it was pretty busy, and there were a lot of other kids. There were 2 lifeguards there, but were generally too busy chatting with each other to be doing their jobs. As my mother later tells me, I was off with my neighbor's daughter, was my age, and Peter. I don't remember why, but he suddenly flew into a fit and decided that I was at fault for something. He, being about 8 and a lot bigger than me, grabs my head and holds it under the water. I remember that. I remember not being able to breathe. I remember clearly thinking that I needed air or I was going to die. I remember fighting, but not being strong enough to get him off of me. Then I remember my mom's face. She had a clear look of both terror and fury. I remember looking over and seeing Peter sitting with his arms around his knees, rocking back and forth as his mother tried to calm him down. Then I remember my mom absolutely losing it on the lifeguards, who had missed everything and were clueless as to why this tiny woman was screaming at them that her daughter had almost drowned on their watch. To this day, I have a fear of swimming and absolutely do not like having water on my face, even when I'm showering. I was abducted at a gas station during undergrad. The locks on my car were broken, and as soon as I got back in, a strange man came in and forced me to drive him to an ATM. I'm paralyzed with fear, so any sense or reason I had went out the window. He claimed he worked at Wendy's, and for my generosity he would give me all the Wendy's I ever wanted. On the way to the ATM he showed me pictures of his daughters on his clearly stolen cell phone. Then a Whitney Houston song came on the radio, and he starts bawling his eyes out and screaming, "Why do all the good people have to die? Only bad things should happen to bad people." I go to the ATM, take out cash, give it to him thinking it's over. He then makes me get back in the car and drive him somewhere else. We pass by some train tracks, and I'm thinking this is it. This is where I will be murdered. He asks me what I'm studying in school, and I tell him biochemistry. I believe in jet propulsion and all that shit. We are not alone, aliens are among us. He then makes me pull over at a gas station, and he tells me drive away sweetheart. I call the cops, had to do a lineup. Apparently this dude had done this to a ton of other women, and some were less unscathed than I was. I, 18F back then, now 25, was on my way home at night after meeting a friend. My home was just 10 minutes away from the train station. After a few minutes I felt someone following me. No big deal I thought, just someone else walking home. But I started walking faster. I realized the person behind me was catching up. Weird. In my head I started to make up scenarios of how to defend myself if the person would attack me. Never would I think of this to actually happen. Well, until I felt something on the back of my head, hitting me hard. I went furious. I turned around and attacked the guy. My mind was just full of anger towards this stranger who, what I thought, hit me. We were wrestling until I fell on the ground. He was sitting on top of me, strangling me. I tried to crawl my nails into his eyes as deep as I could, but I started to black out. Suddenly there was this thought in my head, wake up, or you will die. Well, adrenaline kicked in again, and I opened my eyes and screamed at the top of my lungs, attacking him again. That helped. He stood up and began to run. I laid there for a few seconds, then I started to run home, still screaming. My mom was already at our door and opened for me because my screams woke her up, or her mother senses, who knows? She immediately called the cops and they could arrest him on the same night. It turned out that he actually shot me in my head from behind. They assumed that the gun didn't work properly, the bullet didn't penetrate my skull and stuck in there, but as far as I know they never found out why the gun misfired. I'm glad though. He told the cops that he already followed me a few times in the past, but never had the guts to do it. He wanted to kill me and rape my dead body. I know that's a wild story. I have some Swiss newspaper articles as a source, if someone cares though. I was riding in a train across Eastern Europe. I was running low on money, and even though I had been warned that a woman should not travel alone in second class seating, I did not spring for first class. I was sitting alone in one of the compartments that seats 6. This was also a mistake and a very stupid one to sit alone. Eventually the train stopped, and a man got on. He was very drunk. He came into my compartment and I guess thought I looked like his ex-wife. He attacked me. If it were not for the fact that this particular station was the border between 2 countries, I would be dead. Instead, border patrol from both countries were on the train, and while I was unable to scream, the door was open and at least a half a dozen uniformed men jumped him and saved me. I was in the hospital for a little while but recovered. At one point during the trial, one of the cops asked me if I wanted him and his buddies to hold the guy down while I hit him. I thought he was joking, so I said no, go ahead, you do it. I was also joking, but it turns out they took it seriously and were about to. I did put a stop to that at least, but they were so offended that someone from their country would attack a young female American tourist. They were furious with him. So many people there depended upon tourism. Wow, a serious post I can actually comment on. It wasn't a murder attempt, maybe it was, but a stabbing attempt I guess. Happened when I was around 12 to 13 years old. I was taking a lifeguarding course at a local pool with a friend of mine which had about 16 people in the class. The age ranges in the class can vary, and we probably had a mix of people between 12 to 18, but most were somewhere in the middle. There was this one kid, probably 16 to 17, that really stood out to me, and my friend is the typical school shooter type. Very solemn look on his face at all times, socially awkward and extremely quiet. We both got really strong serial killer vibes from him. It's just one of those instincts you feel that tells you something isn't right. We made a few jokes between ourselves about it, as we both noticed it almost immediately and were fairly uncomfortable being around him. This lasted for probably the first 2 hours of the 4-hour class. At that point we were asked to switch from pool instruction into a classroom and had about 20 minutes to change and get into the classroom. As we are all changing, this guy kept looking over at me and my friend. We tried not to make eye contact with him and just ignore it, but we were getting extremely uncomfortable with how intensely the guy was staring. We were the only 3 in the change room and were intent on leaving as fast as possible. Eventually, my friend makes eye contact with the guy, who screams something along the lines of "Stop looking at me," pulling a switchblade out of his swim bag and lunging at my friend. I stood there, somewhat frozen as this was happening, and didn't really know what to do, whether to try and help or run. My friend ended up blocking the initial lunge with the locker door, and he sprinted towards the front exit of the change room, with this enraged knife-wielding teenager chasing him. When my friend had made it out of the change room, the maniac turned around and started chasing me down. With pool deck floors, they are extremely slippery and almost impossible to run on, but 12-year-old me wasn't exactly worried about that at this point. I had to run from the change room / locker area, through the bathrooms, through a shower room, and then onto the pool deck. The only other exit, all I remember, is him catching up to me, and he must have been within reach at some point on this 100 meters run. But I remember turning around once I made it on the pool deck and the guy was gone. I was half dressed and basically still sprinting towards the lifeguard office. Once there I found our instructor and told him what happened, and he didn't believe me. He said I was lying and was just picking on the kid, nothing happened, etc. So I told him to try and find my friend with me. I was panicking, hyperventilating, but apparently not believable. My friend was still out in the lobby now with a ton of concerned parents around trying to figure out what was going on. Turns out when he blocked the knife with the locker door, the knife got his forearm and he was bleeding pretty badly. Not arterial, but probably a 6 inches gash on the hairy part of your arm. Immediately my instructor ushered us away and called the police. Building went into lockdown, etc. To this day I have no idea what happened to that kid. He never came back to the class, and the police didn't find him that night. I'm assuming he got arrested, but I never heard about it. It was probably the closest I ever came to getting killed, and I'm not exactly sure why / how he didn't stab me, or if he slipped and fell before making it to me. He was considerably larger than me and definitely faster. All I know now is I should trust my instincts more with people. They might turn out to be true. This all happened many years ago. I was the lead man at a factory. A girl starts working there, and I take an interest. After a few months, I find out she is in a terrible drug-fueled abusive relationship. Every night, I tell her to call me, I'll come get her. Finally, after months, she calls me, I come get her, and take her to my house. The guy she was in the relationship with didn't take too kindly to me taking her away. He spends the next 2 years harassing and threatening us. A few months after she and I got married, we went out for a few drinks. Her ex just happened to be at the bar we went to. He apologized to us for the threats and harassment. We were sitting outside talking with a few other people. Next thing I know, I'm on my back on the ground with someone choking me. I try all I can to get them off of me, but being blindsided and them being on top of me, it wasn't easy. As I struggle to get free, everything goes black. Then I see the light at the end of the tunnel. In that moment I was certain that this was the end of me. I somehow managed to get a better hold of this person's head, and I yanked them off of me. We run to the car and get away. A week or so later, my wife had been talking to everyone she thinks might know what happened. Turns out, her ex had paid 2 people $50 to kill me that night. I was doing volunteer work in Central America, working in a really bad area of the capital city. It was a slum built on top of the city's garbage dump. The whole place reeked of trash, and there were large metal cylinders coming up out of the ground throughout the area to vent the gas from decomposing garbage underground. As a fellow volunteer and I walked down a dirt path, 2 men approached us. I'd never seen them before. They were acting strangely, but I just thought they were drunk or high. A lot of people in the area drank rubbing alcohol to get drunk, since it was cheaper than beer or liquor. Over time, drinking the rubbing alcohol would really mess with their brains. As the men got closer, they began acting really friendly, too friendly. One of them came close to me, trying to put his arm around my shoulders. At first, it seemed like the behavior of a guy who gets happy and friendly when he's drunk. However, an alarm went off in my head, and I gently, but firmly, pushed him away. I tried to make it seem light-hearted and playful, like, hey, man. How's it going? Affectionate shove. I didn't want to make a scene. Since I was a gringo, I didn't want to seem like an ugly American. This went on over and over down the whole path. He'd get close, I'd shove him off, he'd come close again. Finally, my friend and I came to a fork in the path, and we went one way, while they went another. After we got to the house of some people we knew, we told them about the 2 guys. I was so focused on protecting myself, I didn't even notice much of what was happening with the other guy. They said, "Oh, everyone around here knows him. That's his routine. He comes up to people, pretends to be friendly, puts his arm around them, then pulls out his knife and stabs them in the stomach." I was that close to getting stabbed to death. When I was 2 weeks into my first job as a 16-year-old at a smoothie establishment that should be known to NBA fans, we were robbed. It was late, and my coworker's friends had been playing pranks on her all day, so when I saw someone burst through the door, I thought it was just that. Until, that is, I had something metal pressed against my back and an arm wrapped around my chest. The robber gave the whole stereotypical "give me all the money" spiel and ordered us to go into the back room, kneel down, and face the wall. As I was kneeling and hearing him walking towards us, time seemed to slow down. Thankfully, I had been refilling juices whenever he came in, and so the door to the back room was partially blocked by a heavy cart. With whatever substance he was on, he wasn't coordinated enough to get past it to us, so he fled. He was followed by my coworker's husband and caught. When he was caught, they found an industrial-sized pipe wrench wrapped tightly in his fist so that he could get a stronger grip when swinging. I'm so glad that cart was there. Once a year or so, I would look him up in the parish prison roster to see if he was still in jail. One year, he suddenly wasn't. I later found him named in a lawsuit as having stabbed his cellmate a half-dozen times while the guy was asleep. Definitely doesn't seem like the nicest of people. 9 years later, I'm still unpacking this incident in therapy. It's why I don't like walking around cities at night or sitting where I can't see the door. My dad was a meth addict. He did lots of fucked up things, dropping me off at trap houses to have sleepovers with other coke babies, living in a house full of animal shit and hoarding. He sicked his pit bull on a black child. He was a real fucking character. One night he came looking for my mom and I at our place. Mom wasn't there. Grandma was babysitting me. I was sleeping in bed when somebody started to try and open my window. It was locked, but they kept jamming something into the bottom to try and force it open. At the same time, I heard the living room door being tried by somebody else. My grandma snuck into my room in her nightgown, apparently woken up by the same thing, and told me say nothing. Don't even whisper. We laid under my bed while a group of men shouted for my mom to come out, slammed their hands on the windows to try and break them, and jumped on my grandma's car. She called the police and barely whispered into the phone. Eventually the cops arrived and the men scattered. Long story short, my dad and his other meth head friends came to the house with guns and knives with every intention to kill me and my mother because she was going to get custody of me. If my mom wasn't so vigilant with locks, we had 3 different kinds on the front and back doors, we would have died. I was 19 driving through the center of Johannesburg, South Africa from Wits University. During rush hour, loads of cars and people. I was winding up my window, old Golf, when 4 guys come up and surround my car. In the car was myself, my sister, and my 3 friends. As I was rolling up my window, the guy at my window reaches into my car and switches the ignition off and goes for my keys, all the while yelling phones and wallets now, or you die. I did the only natural thing and grabbed his arm and held him in the car window fighting for my keys. He pulled out and came down hard on my arm. Twice. Second time something snapped and I let go. I thought I had broken my arm. He flees and all his guys go to. My mates jump out and start chasing them down. I found the keys on the road just outside my door. I can't drive. Arm is broken. I jump into the back seat as my mate returns with blood on his shirt. He jumps in the driver's seat and pulls off like a madman. All of this within 2 minutes, at a red light with about 30 cars around us. No one stopped to help, they just drove around us. Only then did I realize I had been stabbed twice on the arm. The second time the guy had severed all of my tendons in my forearm and there is blood everywhere like Dexter splatter patterns on the seats, windows, and myself. Luckily I had a roll of bandage in the car, wrapped my arm, and got to the hospital near my place, about 20 kilometers at 1700 hours rush hour, in about 20 minutes. I was in the operating theater within an hour of being stabbed. I could have been stabbed in the chest or neck. Luckily it was just my arm. Fully recovered with an interesting scar and about 95% of my former mobility. I was out with a few friends, and with us was a girl that had just broken up with a psychopath. We didn't know he was a psychopath. We found out that night. We were just walking back home from a restaurant. It was about 1 AM, and the guy came running out of nowhere. I don't know how he knew where, and went to meet us. He ran to the girl, lifted her shirt up, and stabbed her in the gut, literally splitting her belly open like a fish, and then ran off. This whole thing happened really quickly, so we were all in shock. The girl was holding her own intestines in her hands, and she was so shocked that she didn't even seem scared, wasn't screaming or anything. She just stood there. We called an ambulance and they managed to somehow put everything back and sew her up. This happened about 3 years ago, and she still has pretty serious problems with her digestive tract, can't eat certain things and that kind of stuff. That image of her just standing in the middle of the pathway holding her own guts will remain stuck in my head forever. The guy got 13 years in jail BTW. Edit. Now that I think about it, a big part of why they broke up was his constant abuse towards her weight. She wasn't even fat, just a bit on the chubby side. I wouldn't even call that overweight, but he would always tell her that she had a big gut. That was almost an obsession for him. So maybe the fact that he stabbed her in the abdomen is a symbolic action of some sort. I don't know what was in that fuckhead's brain and I honestly don't even want to know. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. Please leave a like and subscribe.